Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas. A gente está dando início a mais um seminário da casa aqui no Cebrap, com apoio do CCI, que é o Centro para Imaginação Crítica, e do NDD, Núcleo Direito e Democracia, aqui do Cebrap. A gente está recebendo o Paolo Gerbaudo, que é, enfim, referência, né, para muitas pessoas que estudam o tema, né, de movimentos sociais, mídias sociais, digitalização, né, da vida contemporânea do Estado. Enfim, para falar agora desse tema novo que ele está estudando, está lançando um livro, né, sobre esse tema, que é a Transformação Digital do Estado. O Paolo Gerbaudo, ele é doutor em mídia e comunicação pelo Goldsmiths College, na University of London, professor do Departamento de Humanidades Digitais e diretor do Centro de Cultura Digital do King's College, em Londres. Ele também é pesquisador visitante sênior no Departamento de História, Teorias e Geografias Políticas da Universidade Complutense de Madrid. Ele, enfim, sociólogo, né? Ele está se dedicando à pesquisa da política no século XXI, né, já há anos, com foco em temas como populismo, transformação dos partidos políticos e mídias digitais no ativismo contemporâneo. No Brasil, ele já publicou Estado de Caos, Capitalismo e Governo no Mundo Catastrófico, Redes e Ruas, Mídias Sociais e Ativismo Contemporâneo, e Máscaras e Bandeiras, Populismo, Cidadania e Protesto Global, pela editora Funilaria, e pela editora Todavia, publicou O Grande Recuo, a Política Pós-Populismo e Pós-Pandemia. Lá fora, vocês podem comprar livros do Paolo Gerbaudo, tem banquinhas ali de livros, então, né, no final do evento, todo mundo pode ali comprar os livros. E, enfim, a palestra que o Paulo vai dar para a gente vai ser em inglês, ela não vai ser transmitida ao vivo, mas ela vai ser gravada e disponibilizada posteriormente no canal de YouTube do Cebrap. Então, aqui ao meu lado está a Fabiola, que é, né, diretora coordenadora, né, do NDD, e que vai fazer parte aqui da mesa junto comigo. Quer se apresentar, Fabiola?
Bom, eu sou coordenadora do NDD, como a Camila disse, e diretora de formação do CCI, Center for Critical Imagination, e, enfim, a gente vai dividir a mesa, a gente organizou conjuntamente, e é isso, Paulo, muito obrigada por ter topado vir aqui, imagino que você deve estar com um monte de atividades no Brasil, é um prazer tê-lo, e fique à vontade, com você.
Muito obrigado, muito bem. Muito obrigado ao Cebrap, a Fabiola, a Bianca, a Camila, para hospedar-me. Não vou falar em ítalo-portunhol, porque já é feito isso ontem, então melhor evitar falar 2 vezes em ítalo-portunhol. Não somente portunhol, que já é muito pobre, mas ítalo-portunhol até, que é um pouco demais. Então, so I'm going to speak about, what I'm going to speak about is a new research project, which very much kind of, I'm very much happy to be here because it's, especially in Sao Paulo, I know that there's an audience that has read my book, that has really engaged with my work, and so I feel at home in a way, like to really discuss how this work is placed in what I've been doing before. And what I'm doing now, first and foremost, how it is placed in this research trajectory, and how it hopefully speaks to questions that many people have in mind, no? About contemporary political dilemmas, how they tie into contemporary organizational dilemmas, and how they speak to contemporary political experience, to contemporary individual experience, to contemporary institutions, their transformation, and so on and so forth. And this presentation basically is a presentation of my current work, my current project, which is this work that I have started in Madrid, because now I moved actually to Complutense for a year and a half. And it's a project which is titled The Contactless State, which is very much kind of a hypothesis in a way. Sorry, it's not, okay. The project is called The Contactless State, which is very much indication of the hypothesis that I'm pursuing. And fundamentally, it's a project on the digital transformation of public services and state bureaucracy, which is, in a way, quite a new theme for me. And its attempt is to develop a sociology, or better, a critical sociology of these issues. And today I'm going to present in a way, since I feel at home and I feel comfortable showing you finished work. Partly I'm going to show you working hypotheses, basically provocations that I'm kind of working on, because I've just started the project and I'm still doing some papers for the old project. So I'm kind of like still kind of crunching ideas, and I haven't done the proper field work. So it's a good phase to basically test hypotheses and see whether the conceptual framework makes sense. And in particular, I'm going to focus on one hypothesis that is more of a kind of a conceptual hypothesis, or a kind of critical theory hypothesis, which concerns ultimately this dilemma or this paradox. So digital transformation of the state partly has to do with our hate for bureaucracy. How many people love bureaucracy in this room? Many? One? Very good. No? There's not many lovers of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is not a team that has many supporters, right? I mean, when people talk of bureaucracy, usually they do talk of bureaucracy to complain of how bad bureaucracy is, right? Because of the frustration they had, the queue they had to make, something that is not working, with their procedure, long waiting time, not understanding things, right? For the people who have read Kafka, which was one of my favorite reading, right? I mean, the experience of the law, the castle, right? Even more than the trial, right? Really this wandering through the labyrinth, the maze of the castle, and not really understanding what is happening to you. That is a very common experience, right? And we can think about kind of our popular culture is just replete with examples of expression of frustration with bureaucracy, from Asterix and Obelix and the Roman offices where they ran around, and until contemporary politics. You know, partly much of the discourse of the right is really framed as a rejection of the state, as the administrative state. Let's think about Millet wanting to destroy all the ministries, leaving just 4 or 5, the repressive ones, basically. Or let's think now about Trump, who, as things stand, looks like the next president of the US. And the fact that he wants to bring into government Elon Musk, whose project is very much a kind of a Milletian project of doing away with the state, as they call it, or let's say a part of the state, and instating this new department called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, from the famous meme, the famous dog, meme dog, the people who are into internet culture will know. So it's quite interesting how, on the one hand, how in our zeitgeist, in our popular culture and political discourse, there is this very strong hate for bureaucracy. And it also straddles to the left. Let's think about David Graeber. I mean, one of his key themes, of course, was how inhumane bureaucracy is. Right? In his famous book on bureaucracy, he describes when he basically has to fill a form after his mother dies. So the state has no piety, has no respect, wants to transform everything in a kind of instrumental cage. And here I'm ending the provocation, but the question is that sometimes, so there is basically this desire of doing away with bureaucracy, or solving the question of bureaucracy, which basically often means the dream of doing away with bureaucracy. But perhaps the dream leads to a nightmare. That is, if we want to do away with bureaucracy, perhaps is it not the case that we end up, instead of having a concentrated bureaucracy, which is a concentrated problem, becoming all of us bureaucrats of sorts, which is an horror scenario. I mean, even more, if we hate bureaucracy, thinking that we internalize bureaucracy, perhaps is even scarier than a concentrated bureaucracy we hate. Yeah. So here is basically the provocation I'm putting forward. The digital transformation of the state is often presented as a panacea for many problems affecting public administrations, from sluggish bureaucracy, lousy frontline services, to lack of transparency and corruption. It has been long believed that by becoming more digital, right, the state would, in a way, resolve all these problems, right? It would cut queues, everything would be much faster, would be more direct, more immediate, would be more seamless, a state that resembles Amazon, right, or Uber. You call the state and the state is there in 5 minutes and you go away with it. And that it would become also more user-friendly, but also more citizen-centered. So at the discursive level, it's really interesting to see what the discourse of the state promises to be. And to a great extent is, in a way, an image of the state as a Silicon Valley state. A state that resembles big tech companies, becomes more like big tech companies that many people love precisely because they are user-friendly, right? We can say everything we want about those companies, which we hate for many reasons, exploitative practices, monopolies, environmental footprint, now opening new nuclear power station for their data centers because they are using too much electricity, but it's very hard to criticize them on the point of user-friendliness and service delivery, right? I mean, that's why they've been so efficient. So as I shall argue in this presentation, the way in which digital transformation has been rolled out has inadvertently created its own problematic side effects by shifting a significant administrative burden onto individual citizens, right, who now need to become do-it-yourself citizens or amateur bureaucrats or self-bureaucrats who have basically to process by themselves a lot of administrative tasks that were previously specialized tasks that were processed by professional bureaucrats who knew what they were doing, right? You were going to an office, of course, you were bringing your information, right, your documents, but you were not kind of doing data entry. You were not figuring out which category you belong to. You were not figuring out if you have this allowance for taxes or don't have that allowance, no? You were not kind of making sense of tax code or whatever, environmental code. There was someone who was specialized and was doing that. Yeah. So this is basically the paradox I'm proposing. And I think it is not just a paradox of the relationship with public administration, it's more generally a paradox of the digital era. So in the digital era, there is much this idea of automation as elimination of labor. And so the beauty that, you know, like, so finally you can do things on the fly, just a click at the touch of a button, say, and you skip processes, intermediaries. But actually, much of what that has meant for everyday consumption, for example, is a lot of labor offloading onto individuals. So let's think about buying flights. You become like a travel agency, having to figure out which is the best connection, using flight comparisons, and that goes to whatever, renting a house, having to compare different rent locations, which a housing agency would have done in the past, right? Or even to advertise yourself for flat sharing, how beautiful and how kind you are, and what a wonderful flatmate you will be. There is all these, in a way, invisible labor of which partly is labor of bureaucracy, labor of information processing, and a very unlovely labor people wouldn't like to do if they could avoid. So basically, the project here is to develop a critical sociology of the digital state. So digital transformation of the state is an important trend and a growing topic of discussion. Also, it's also very important because there is lots of money behind this. On the one hand, when I approach it, it is a very boring topic on the one hand, and the kind of the actors who populate the scene are not really the most interesting people. So compared to previous research subjects of my studies, when I was going to protest camps or political parties, is more, in a way, more interesting. Say the human grouping there, while in another way, kind of digital government is not exactly the sexiest subject of all, but I think it is very, very important, and it is very consequential for people. It really affects people's life, often for the worse, and therefore it's an important object of study. So different governments around the world are now pushing to digitalize their bureaucracy. And they're doing that in coordination, right? It's not that each one is kind of figuring out whatever. The Venezuelan way to digital government, or the Angolan way to digital government, or the Malta way to digital government. No, actually, what they're doing is quite similar, though there are national differences, and this is also quite interesting. They bespeak differences in statecraft, institutional history, blah, blah, blah. But there is a strong level of coordination. They're following similar guidelines because they are following 3, 4, 5 international institutions that are issuing recommendations. They are these institutions that have a power of moral suasion. first and foremost, like the OECD most clearly, but then also partly the World Bank, the IMF, and others that besides their more executive power also have this power of moral suasion, providing recommendations, this cognitive power almost of setting the agenda. And there is an enormous body of literature on the topic, but also this body of literature tends to be honestly quite boring. Right? It's not kind of whatever Bourdieu, social sociology of whatever of habitus or whatever Adorno or you name it. It tends to be quite technical, quite instrumentalist ultimately. It tends to be very driven towards best practice, this kind of policy sociology, you could describe it, no? But so precisely because of that, and there is very little, also much of the literature there tends to be a sort of ex-pre literature rather than ex post, in a sense that it's usually positions itself as if digital government wasn't there, but was something to be created in the future, right? In a sense, it puts for, it's very normative, right? Is more about, these are the principles of good government that people should follow, sometimes in the future, rather than evaluating, say, on the go, or what digital government already is, right, in reality. So what is lacking is more of an evaluative approach, critically assessing the effects on the citizenry, and normatively judging the vision of the state that is emerging there. So how does this fit in my previous work? So for the people who know my work, so it's been very much about digital and organizational transformation, first in social movements, the movements of the squares of 2011 and after, and how they were using social media as a means of external communication, but also of internal organization, how it had to do with questions of leadership, horizontality, verticality debates, that are also very Brazilian debates, as Rodrigo Nunes is one of the most influential authors on these questions. And many Brazilian movements are very much kind of engaged with these issues. And then in political parties, right, the debate on the digital party, hyper leaders, super base, blah, blah, and so on and so forth. So in a way here, what I'm trying to do is also, by and large, an organizational sociology of digital transformation, right? And from a standpoint of methodology, in a way, following precisely what they've done in the previous books, is the general standpoint is that of an immanent critique. So following Adorno, namely evaluating practice on the basis of the normative framework put forward by the same actors whose practice we are studying, right? So you're telling me you want to do this, let's see what you do in practice. And let's see what kind of contradictions there are there, because actually this contradiction between principles and behavior, one could read them as simply, or you say, bad behavior, but perhaps they are telling us something about bad principles, which is even more interesting, right? They're telling us about unrealistic objectives, right, which then lead ultimately practice to face impossible obstacles. So let's start from principles. Let's start from discourse. What is the discourse of digital government? What are these people promising? And here again, you have to read a lot of this gray literature. I mean, it is literally boring. I'm not kind of making it up, right? You basically have to read many PDFs that you don't read unless you are a consultant or someone who is a customer of a consultant, right? Which not many people in this room, I think, are. Right, so Accenture, Deloitte, right? These people are very kind of pushing very hard on this agenda, which also makes it suspicious, at least to me, right? So digital transformation can significantly streamline government processes, reducing the time taken to deliver services to citizens, right? Time reduction, cutting you need to wait a lot, now you wait less. United Nations, which also has a digital government division, blah, blah. Digital transformation can make governments more transparent, accountable, and responsive, fostering trust between citizens and public institutions, right? So here there are two elements. There is an element of transparency and accountability, responsiveness. Actually, these are quite different things, no? But say there is more a kind of efficiency-driven element, And then there is more a more of a legitimacy element there, right? In a sense of accountability, transparency, and trust, which is a very key word that I would like you to keep in your mind. Yeah? Finally, Deloitte, our lovely Deloitte, digital government can improve operational efficiency, of course, reduce costs, you were guessing that, by replacing traditional paper-based processes with streamlined, automated systems. Right? So the general discourse you have there, and you have it in these PDFs, this gray literature, but then you also have it in books, which are also tendentially quite gray books, like Springer handbooks, these books that are often worth, whatever, 200 euros and 90 euros. I mean, some of them are really good books, very good reference books, but they tend to be very technical, right, books. And you have some, I mean, some very interesting insights from practice there, right? But they're mostly really written in this perspective of we already know what we need to do, and we are establishing the best ways to go about it, without ever in a way questioning the very vision, the very global vision, right? Or why are we doing this? Why do we need to do this? And what could be actually radically alternative ways to go about that? Yeah? So what is the promise of digital government? I was already showing you some quotes before. I mean, here there are some more. Digital government is about more than technology. Is about, and here we find the element that is more in a way humanistic and not just instrumental. Yeah? Digital government is about more than technology. It's about putting citizens at the center of government processes and adapting services to their needs. Yeah. So there is all these users, these lingo of user-centeredness, right? Or citizen-centeredness, right? So the idea that until now, the government, it was the state, it was the citizen that had to go to government and figure out which department he had to go or she had to go to. Well, now in a way is the state that is like the famous Mohammed and the mountain. Now is the state that comes to you, like, and without you needing to figure out. Yeah. And digital tools, OECD, the digital government division, the OECD perhaps at least in the OECD countries is the most influential of all these recommendation-making bodies. Digital tools foster better communication between government and citizens, facilitating greater public participation in decision-making. Yeah? Though, of course, I mean, here is the more, as again, I said, the more humanistic or solidaristic in a way kind of agenda, which is also there. But of course, kind of, these are two very different things. Increasing efficiency in delivery of government services vis-a-vis public participation, vis-a-vis decision-making, right? These are two very different faces of the state. No? But it's to give you, in a way, a sense of the different expectations that are there. So on the one hand, there is a more utilitarian expectation, increase government efficiency by reducing costs, delivery times, bureaucratic hurdles. And then there is a more democratic expectation, so improving the relationship of citizens with the state, better communication, better transparency, better accountability, even more participations of citizens in the state. Yeah? So some of these letter promise, I mean, even includes in some of the writing the idea that digital government will be the tool through which the state will be able to mend the chronic crisis of trust of citizens in the state, which is at the root of populism, or which is considered to be at the root of populism. Right? So as we know, across most countries, I mean, most notably Western countries, across the last decades, if you ask citizens, what do you think of public institutions? They will say that they distrust them. The only institution they tend to trust a little bit is still the police, right? For better or worse. But all the other institutions are kind of below 50% of trust, right? Sometimes they even trust more companies than they trust state institutions. Yeah? So I think this is very important because it's a very, very tall order. It's a very tall order, of course, to think that by digitalizing the state, you will be able to mend this crisis of trust that has led to populist insurgencies. So since this is an organizational sociology of the state, it's very important to understand what are the general organizational principles behind all this. Yeah. So on the one hand, if you go back to this Deloitte quote, the general idea of digitalization, the imaginary of that is moving from paper-based government to digital archives, to digital information, to data records, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Yeah? So there is a change basically in the materiality of the state, as it were. Moving from this image of these piles of paper. I mean, to me, the most beautiful image of that was when I was in Cairo and going to the Mogama, which was this monstrous government building, a brutalist building, where you would have to go to do the visa, basically. And you would enter these stairs and these labyrinthic offices where there were these modern Egyptian scribes, basically, right? With these huge piles, really, literally. I mean, it looks like something out of a Monty Python movie, right? With these huge piles of forms that had to be processed, right? And you're wondering how the hell did we be able to figure out where each form was, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there is this change and there is also a beautiful ethnography of paper-based government in Pakistan, which very much tells about this, the fundamentality of this materiality of the state. No? So the general idea is this change in materiality, but then there is a change in organization, a change in structure, which is really interesting. So one element is location independence. You don't need to go to a specific office to process a specific procedure. Virtually anywhere, from anywhere, you can do a given procedure. Yeah? Again, this is perhaps by now taken for granted when it comes to many services, yeah? But it is not taken for granted with the state at all, right? With the state, the idea is still, in many countries, that you need to go to whatever, the job place to get unemployment benefits and so on and so forth. With the problem that sometimes you don't know which place you need to go to, or that you go to a place and they bounce you to another place, right? From an office to another office. And the second one, which connects to that, is this citizen-centeredness. So services are organized around users rather than administrative needs. So a part of these, all these, is very interesting, this literature on bureaucracy and administration. There was all this debate, right, on new public administration, which was basically the neoliberal, is considered by many as the neoliberal equivalent of administrative science, right? Which wanted the state to work more like a company, and therefore, like a company, it would have different agencies, and they would be very top-down, blah, blah, blah. But then, many theories of digital government, in a way, are reinstating a principle of administrative autonomy and administrative of the uniqueness of the administrative state, talking about the fact that new public management led to silos, to siloing of the state apparatus. What that means is that you create agencies that are very efficient internally, but they are completely separate. They are sealed from other agencies. Right? They don't exchange data, right? They don't communicate with one another, right? Which is a major factor of inefficiency, right? As citizens are not made of departments. It's not that I have a problem and that speaks to my Department of Health or no. Citizens have lives that cut across all these different departments, right? So a key idea there is this citizen-centeredness, kind of reframing the state around citizens. And then the idea of join the public services, that is, all the states are united under one single website. Okay? This is what countries like the UK now have, like gov.uk is a kind of one port of call. You go to one website, and basically in that website, you can do everything from registering a chip for your dog to declaring bankruptcy, to paying your taxes or claiming your benefits, and so on and so forth. No? And of course, many countries are in very different stages of these. Like Spain, where I'm working, is in a very much worse situation, where you have still different departments with different logins. Like you end up having 12 different logins, and then one ministry website bounces you and sends you to another website, to a passerella, through a virtual walking path, and then it bounces you back, and then there are 5 different types of identification, 5 EIDs, and autonomous communities have their own identification for nationalistic purposes. So it can get very bad, much worse than that. But so in a way, what we want to evaluate is criticize even the best version of digital state, no? Knowing that there are much more nightmarish versions. But a key element there is directness, right? Is this idea of directness. So eliminating the barriers between you and the state and achieving a sort of immediate contact with the state. But of course, this immediate contact with the state is a contact with a state that is also kind of stripped bare of any materiality. It's a contact with a virtual state that is almost phantom-like. No? It's everywhere and nowhere. It's almost like God. And I think this is really interesting from both kind of more philosophical and theoretical angles, and then from very, very practical one. Yeah. So the case study I'm working on, I'm going to go quickly through here because I've already spoken a lot, and I think I'll speak 10 minutes more. And yeah. So is what basically this is what I'm talking about is core policy of the EU, but it's core policy of many countries. I'm sure I haven't looked much into Brazil. I actually would like to, but I'm sure that much of this is also a policy agenda in Brazil. This idea of green and digital transition, which itself is really, really worth. I mean, I have a paper now which is specifically on the vision of digital and green transition, raising the fundamental question of why. I mean, why digital and green? What do we have to do with one another? And who has decided this? No, for how much we all share much of the content of that. No, there are many aspects of the vision that have not really been debated or questioned or critically revised. Yeah. So this is a policy agenda behind which there is a lot of money. So in Next Generation EU, which is a total of 800 billion euros, 20% of that package, there was basically the recovery package after COVID, blah, blah, blah. 20% of that, which, right, so we are talking about a bit less than 200 billion, 280 billion or something like that, is allocated to digital transformation and to more specifically to digitalization of government. Yeah? There's all these programs, right, that are aimed at achieving this digital transition, which span different things: digital public infrastructure, ID systems, transformation of bureaucratic processes, and so on and so on and so forth. So here I come to what I was promising before, namely presenting you half-baked hypotheses, half-baked assumptions on which basically I'm working on. So I start from an inkling that something with this is wrong, no? And then there are many things that I think are possibly wrong there. No? So perhaps a most immediate objection that can be made to that is the famous Morozov objection of techno-solutionism. So what is problematic about this discourse, digital transition, is that there is very little discussion about what its final purpose should be. So fundamentally, it's an instrumentalism, which is a self-feeding instrumentalism. So we need to use these instruments, but for what? For this instrument, no? It's like art for art's sake, is digital government for digital government's sake, almost, no? It's not really clear what is the end goal of that, no? To follow Evgeny Morozov, digital solutionism is the cultural tendency that leads to believing that basically any problem can be solved by applying digital tools. And by and large, this is precisely what is happening there, right? You have all these extremely complex problems of the state that have to do with low funding of state services, that have to do with crisis of legitimacy of the state, that have to do with whatever, I mean, lack of infrastructure, of citizen empowerment, ability to engage with the state, and you think you solve it basically by creating apps or something like that. No? And so Morozov attributes this mostly to the mentality of Silicon Valley, but precisely in a way what the digital government is trying to turn the state into Silicon Valley. Then the second one, which I was already in a way anticipating, is there is a strong austerity agenda behind a lot of this. Though many consultants working in the sector don't want to hear that, don't want to admit that, or at least in many countries, perhaps not in all countries, not necessarily. But for example, in the UK, where there was a very strong, a very coherent agenda for digital government, that took place under the coalition government and under the fiercest wave of cuts to public spending experienced in Britain since the end of World War II, even deeper, according to some metrics, than the cuts of Margaret Thatcher. So the way it was sold, and it was actually quite radical, a politics that was also fighting against resistance from other ministries, because there is a very political contention there. When you change the state, you immediately enter into conflict with ministries that want to keep their own power while you have to centralize it, right? So it was radical in many respects, but it was possible precisely because it promised to save tons of money. I think that the main minister that was behind that said that in total it saved over the course of the legislature something like 20 billion pounds, which is a huge amount. In many countries, basically that has been accompanied by the closing down of offices or by freezing of turnover of public employees, right? With some of the activities, some of the procedures, some of the labor of bureaucrats being transferred online, fundamentally. The third objection are new risks of exclusion, right? So there is a very evident difference between, there is a continuing problem of digital divide, fundamentally, which is much deeper. Actually, the more society becomes digitalized, the more digital divide is entrenched, paradoxically, because it doesn't have to do simply with access to digital tools or quality of connection. It has to do with competencies, and it acquires only greater depth and width, precisely the more processes are expected to be performed online. And there are some glaring forms of exclusion. So let's think about the case of the UK. In the UK, as in the US, they don't have ID cards, right? And that gives people the illusion that they are free. Because the state, right? You're not registered with the state. It's really fascinating, the difference with our states, like Napoleonic states, where you're registered as a citizen from day 2, perhaps. But that means practically that there are, for registering for the EID, the Gov UK, you need some form of identification, and there are 3 million citizens, which is a small amount of the British population, which is around, by now, almost 70 million citizens, but still, it's 3 million people. These 3 million people have no form of identification whatsoever, which means that they cannot use digital services, which are increasingly becoming not an option, but basically the default option people are expected to use. Right, so there's already studies, that show that the very big differences in terms of preparedness, readiness, in terms of digital government. Well, guess what? The richest will actually profit from it, while marginal regions in Europe. If you look at the geopolitics of Europe, it's crazy. The peripheral areas are the poorest ones, and are also the least prepared ones. So it will only entrench more inequality. So there is this other problem of kind of a purely instrumental state. So basically furthering this tendency that has already been there with neoliberalism, where the state, actually already with a welfare state, partly, this is of Habermas, that the state is perceived increasingly as a provider of service, that where there is not really a sense of affiliation or a sense of duty, responsibility, participation. And a state that becomes, and here it comes to the thesis of the general hypothesis of the project, I mean, this sense of contactlessness, no? Vis-a-vis the bulky and slow pre-digital world, the digital world wants to satisfy needs immediately and without complication. And here there is a curious resonance of some of themes that I encountered working on the digital party, no? Because in the digital party, for those who read it, basically the idea is that in these parties like Podemos, five-star parties, the dream is precisely that. Let's eliminate the bureaucrats. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could eliminate party bureaucrats? Are not party bureaucrats the problem for people as different as Mao Zedong, I mean, Che Guevara, and whatever, Ronald Reagan, or I mean, are not functionaries the problem, also inside parties? You know? The problem, though, is that in digital parties, in this dream of directness, by doing away with bureaucrats, with intermediate layers, you destroy the very structure of the party, and you turn them into personal parties, fundamentally, plebiscitary parties. So partly the same thing is risks happening here. This idea of contactlessness is problematic in a number of ways, also because it frames the state simply as a problem. You don't want to have contact with the state. You want to keep as far away, almost as if the state was contagious or something. No? You don't want contact. You don't want to waste time. No, you want to move through as quickly as possible. No, the state is a McDonald's drive-in, whatever. No, and here I come to the final thesis, which is perhaps the one I thought about the most. So it is this notion of self-service. No? The promise of digital government is to provide more efficient services for citizens to go about various bureaucratic procedures against the background of traditional bureaucracy, blah, blah, blah. But in practice, it means self-service. So it's like self-checkout in supermarkets. I mean, also in Brazil now, in many countries, like the Carrefour I go to now these days, this self-checkout, which means that, I mean, it may seem like something trivial, like whatever. Why do you complain about doing self-checkout? But actually, it's something that is really become systemic across many aspects of our lives. That we're now expected to do work, that before we were not expected to do, even when we are consuming, and therefore we are expected basically to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Instead, even at that point, we are expected to labor, and this is also what happens, for example, with health in the US. Our US friends, who think, they also think they are free, because they don't have ID cards, and they also think that not having socialized health, they avoid socialism, which is very dangerous for them. And if you ask any US friend what the hell it is to deal with health insurance and the amount of self-bureaucracy that involves, in terms of comparing different insurance packages and allowance and limits and what should I do, and forecasting whether you're going to have a cancer in 3 years or not, whether you should buy that insurance coverage or not. All things which are completely crazy for anyone who enjoys still the eroding benefits of public health. This is just an example, right, of what happens when you think you're doing away with bureaucracy and freeing yourself of the constraints of the bureaucratic monster, only to discover that you've become yourself the bureaucratic monster you so much despised. So there is an element really of a functional element there that has to do with being lost in the complexity of digital spaces, having to deal with information overload, having to figure out extremely complex information. I mean, for example, doing a tax return. The tax code is the most complex document in our civilization. We are talking about tens of thousands of pages, and in turn citing hundreds of laws and changing through time. There are professionals who are tasked with figuring out what is that, but now often citizens, individual citizens, are expected to figure out for themselves what they're doing, while they basically they're not able to. It's like when you sign this contract with Silicon Valley companies, and you're supposed to figure out what is written there, and you just press yes, out of despair and helplessness. And what it also means, is that the end of what Lipsky called the street-level bureaucrat, which was this person at the clerk, that you could go to and ask support, cognitive support or emotional support, if you were kind of had a major frustration, or whether you had to basically campaign or put pressure to get your services. Because ultimately services, right, they are not just a service, but they are a right. Therefore, that's what often happens in front of public offices, and still happens. People picketing, right? People demanding their rights, either individually or collectively. So here I come finally to a conclusion, right? There is a needed element to this process of digitalization of the state. Unlike other processes of digitalization, which are supposed to lead to the elimination of unnecessary labor, digital government does not really eliminate bureaucracy. Rather, it eliminates, let's say, centralized bureaucracy, official bureaucracy, or it erodes it at least, but at the cost of making all citizens bureaucrats, and thus suffer from the pains and troubles which previously only bureaucrats had to shoulder. Thanks.
Obrigada, Paolo. Muito interessante. Muito interessante e levemente desesperador. Acredito que todos nós passamos e conhecemos histórias, enfim, que fazem todo sentido com a sua apresentação. Bom, agora a gente vai abrir para perguntas. Não sei quem que é. A Bianca, Márcio, e Léo, Felipe. Bom, só pedindo, como a gente está gravando, para vocês se apresentarem e dizerem de onde vocês são, antes da pergunta. Eu acho que a gente pode, de repente, fazer 2 rodadas. Sim, tá bom. Pode ser em português?
Perfeito.
Sim, pode ser em português.
Well, thank you so much, Paolo. It's a great pleasure to have you here after 4 years. And it's very inspiring. And me, myself, as a law professor, have to do with a lot of that. Not a tax lawyer, but actually some of the things. So I'm thinking 2 things out of what you just presented to us. The hypothesis of us becoming the bureaucrat, does it not entail that we are also a different kind of bureaucrat, because we are isolated bureaucrats? We do not have esprit de corps. We're not in the sense of collectively sharing. We're not having the coffee in the aisle with the other bureaucrats. We're not sharing the experiences with others of bureaucracy. Maybe we were talking about it on, I don't know, X, Twitter about it, but like a fragmentation of what it is to have like a culture of using that. So that's the first thing, that we have to deal with that, but we have to deal with that in an isolated way. It comes to my mind. And the other thing that I'm also thinking that has a direct connection with my research agenda is that the whole theme of smart cities. So how we're not only looking at digital government in a very federal or concentrated sense, but looking specifically at cities. And sometimes, or maybe this is something that can shed some light in what you're looking at as well. So what I'm wondering, and I want to hear a bit more from you, is that how you see the digitalization as a part of using of data, like personal data, that you are now collecting a lot of personal data in a more, much more concentrated and efficient sense in the way to control people's lives as well. So how does this play a role? Because in the whole discussion of the smart city, and you have Morozov as well talking about it, Francesca Bria, the one of the whole point is surveillance. So how does this fit into your framework? And if you're looking at that, and if you think that this is something that's also important in this shift. Thank you.
Should I answer directly, or do we want to? Perhaps I'll answer directly to that, and then we can perhaps the next round, so that I don't forget, because there were two very interesting questions there. The first one is very easy, because, I mean, not because the question is easy, but because I've been thinking a lot about it. And yeah, it's really this kind of atomization, ultimately, you know, of people's experience. And the fact that, yeah, I mean, location independence means loneliness as well, no? It means comfort in many respects. Yeah, I can do my tax return at 3 o'clock in the morning after coming back from a disco on a taxi if I want to, say, I mean, whatever, if that is a convenient thing to do. But I'm doing that by myself. The frustration is mine, and it's more frustrating precisely because of that. There's not a socialization, right, of that experience. And therefore also not a politicization, perhaps, of that, no? Perhaps the only politicization is precisely what you say, kind of like, you know, angry post on social media saying how bad was this, no? So there is, yeah, a way in which the lack of a space, of experience of the state, no, deprive you of that sense of kind of communal experience, also the bad aspects of the state. And then, of course, I mean, there's a great element of surveillance there, which is partly what, I mean, at least the states that are already at the state, say, 2 or 3 of digitalization are really starting to do. And that can be used really to pursue, I mean, social engineering in very granular ways. You know? Also with very, I mean, for example, what has happened, the famous case in the Netherlands, where the algorithm, an algorithm was used to detect welfare fraud, and it established the algorithm that people who had two passports, whatever, were more prone to be commit welfare fraud. So it started issuing basically denunciation just to people for having 2 passports, regardless of whether you're committed as welfare fraud or not. So yeah, there is a degree of return of control of the state, and also of very, I would say, covert forms of authoritarianism that they're really scary, and of social engineering that are really scary. But partly, yeah, what they reproduce is what is already normal in the private world, no? in the corporate world. Yeah? On the other hand, though, yeah, there is also huge democratic potential for using this data for democratic purposes, also because of the new avenues for planning and for democratic planning it opens. Yeah? Because often one of the arguments in favor of market supremacy was that it had more information. Well, now there is a lot of kind of actually public data that can be harvested for that purpose. But I think, yeah, the control of the data, because often what neoliberal politicians do is just taking this public data and giving it away to corporations for free or very low price. So as Francesca Bria, among many people, really emphasize, the control of that data is crucial for the destiny of digital politics. Yeah.
Hi, Paolo. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Felipe. I would like to ask you more about the political economy aspect of the digital state, because as we know, they need to rely on private-owned infrastructure. I'm thinking about cloud service and so on. So how this relates to your project, because you were focusing on this question in the problem of the communication between citizen and state, but there is this third part that is inevitable due to technological and economic necessity. And how this, and I would like to stress something similar to what Bianca said, that how, for example, this conjunction between private power and public power interferes in the normative aspects about the state itself harvesting data, because you cannot strictly separate between like a public way of doing, like producing and using data, and how this affects policy, and its private aspect about how this private corporations will have access to the data of citizens. So yeah, that's it about this political economic aspect. Thank you.
Yes, completely. And that touches upon the famous kind of digital sovereignty agenda, no? Which has been a huge topic of discussion, and the more so in Brazil, especially after the famous battle between Elon Musk and Brazil, where Brazil won. And it's a very hot topic of discussion in Europe, but it is a very hot topic of discussion, full stop. As Europe basically is doing very little to do any of that, because it would entail questioning its power relations with the US, because now Europe is completely reliant on US platforms. And of course, I mean, curiously, you would say that, the digital public infrastructure agenda, so basically the state availing itself of its cloud services, of EIDs, of digitalized public services, that it would be something that is good as such, but actually many big tech corporations are pushing that because they're hoping to get downstream contracts for clouds and so on and so forth. And we know, so if we talk about political economy, we know that the level of capital accumulation and the firm concentration in that sector is the highest of any sector, basically in the history of capitalism, right? I mean, the laws of scale, network effects, there are all these tendencies that conjure in the direction of making it very difficult for you to be sovereign. So now, for example, in Europe, what you have is countries like Germany that basically have really realized that they need to do something about it. And they're talking about national clouds. But often these projects are very voluntaristic, and they really look like bad examples of statism. They are completely these white elephants, I don't know how you say, kind of like, cathedrals in the desert, where the state sets up this infrastructure that is very badly made, and ultimately you need to face up that those companies are there precisely because they're extremely efficient, and you don't challenge, you don't create a substitute unless you afford enormous investment to that, and secondly, whether you do it at the scale where you can actually do that. So in the case of Europe, not even Germany, which is the largest country in Europe, can do that, but you can probably only do it at a continental level. And secondly, it will entail some degree of kind of private-public partnership. So, I mean, is not that I think personally that private companies are bad, or I mean, at some point, from a standpoint of pragmatism, you need to involve them, but involve them under very tight control of the state and disciplined by the state, which is exactly the contrary of what happens now, where, as some people say, Facebook, I mean, Alphabet and Meta, they basically have their own diplomats. When they have dealings with countries, they are presenting themselves as if they were states of their own kind. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have woken up to this question of infrastructure. I mean, there's countries that have solved, like China has basically dealt to it in its own way. You may say it's good or not. Russia has also done that. So basically, at some point, those countries have decided that if they wanted to maintain even a semblance of sovereignty, they had basically to do a splinter net. They had to balkanize the internet, and they had to create their own platforms. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only way you can do it, right? But that's one way that can be done. And it highlights that unless you have not total control, but some degree of control over infrastructure, there's any talk of autonomy, relative autonomy, is just a red herring.
Hi, Paolo. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Maria. I'm an editor for Phenomenal World. Actually, we'll be together on Monday. But I have actually two complementary questions to the one that Bianca made and the other person that I forget the name actually. That like the first thing that was striking to me is we become bureaucrats, but it's just us, right? Like they're not creating a platform for lobbying, for example, where you have to log in and then you put your proposals there and like your balance sheets and show your participation in GDP and so on. So that keeps like a very personal relation. So the state bureaucracy keeps existing for some part of citizenship exercise. And then the other thing is that we just lose the first right that every bureaucrat has, that is not moving the paperwork. Like we suddenly have to do it. But my question was, like Bianca mentioned the aspect of surveillance, and then someone brought up the aspect of some kind of, I don't know, epistemological maybe modeling when you're treating data. But I got thinking that, and I wonder if any of the reports, I'm the kind of person that likes to read the boring reports, is approaching that, because when I'm responsible for filling data on like that, I don't know, tax paperwork, for example, I am highly likely to make mistakes because I don't understand anything about what I'm doing. And then you have a huge amount of public data that's not properly processed. For example, in Brazil, you can have two tax IDs, like one as a regular natural person and one as a firm, even like not being an actual firm. And then when you're gonna declare your income, you do that as a person or as a firm. And then when you're thinking of income distribution, you're thinking of that share of people as firms, and then that's capital profit or anyway, like that kind of problem in processing data. I wonder if you came across that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just incredible that the set of traps that you can fall into. I mean, one can also make a typology of that. You know, there are some infinite loops that you enter, you know, where you are dealing with bureaucracy. I mean, these are these famous things. I mean, for example, and they have to do with bureaucracy in general, no? Like they have to do with really with the kind of flow of bureaucracy that sometimes really lead to that. No? For example, when I settled in Spain, to become a foreign resident, you need to go to police, to the Department of Foresteria, which is a very interesting name. Like Foresto in Italy is like a very old name for a foreigner. No? And to register and to go there, you need to pay the state money, which is a very small amount of money. It's like 23, no? It's a fee. And you need to pay it through the bank. But in order to have a bank account, you know, to pay through the bank, you need to have a bank account. To have a bank account, you need to have registration as foreign resident. So basically, you cannot, right? It's like a script, an algorithm that doesn't work. No, is an infinite loop, and the only way out to the infinite loop is actually physical there, because next to the police station there is a bank that has a special cashier where you can actually enter money and get a receipt. No, but that is really curious. Or there's precisely, I mean, and these something as banal as wrong ID. I mean, it has happened to me. Like now, now many governments are moving. They want to do away with cards, even. No, for example, your ID card for university. Why ID card for university when you can have a beautiful app with the ID card? No. So last year I didn't manage to get my Complutense ID card because for the entire year my user ID was not recognized. No, until this year I met a street-level bureaucrat, a very kind street-level bureaucrat, who figured out that perhaps it was because I was giving the wrong document. It was not registered with my foreign ID, but was registered with my passport number. No, something as stupid as that. But these are really mistakes that speak precisely. It goes back to individualization. So you don't figure it out, because there is no expert knowledge that is telling you what the possible different scenarios could be, right? And giving you expert way out of this situation. And the question, I mean, of course, it's not that all bureaucracy is being done away. I mean, it's much of a kind of frontline services that are often being sacrificed. They're often also being sacrificed first in more rural areas or more peripheral areas. And I think also the left should really kind of interrogate itself a lot about that, about how austerity has been disproportionately meted on rural and semi-rural areas, which suffer disproportionately, and also where there is a fundamental injustice in terms of access to public services, because public services are concentrated in towns, right? And therefore, urban residents have more easy access to public services. And so the austerity agenda there is really ravaged what remained of the state. No? And I think that is partly a reason for the current discontent with the state that informs Trump, Milei, and other people.
Is it okay to ask in Portuguese, right?
Yeah.
Boa, então bora lá. Eu sou o Fernando, tudo bem? Fernando Baldraia, daqui do CCI-Cebrap, da Companhia das Letras, editor. Duas perguntas. A primeira é, quando você estava dizendo, ou pelo menos dentro dos próprios critérios apresentados, de que a digitalização reivindica esse aumento de accountability, da possibilidade de confiança, você até pediu para a gente manter essa palavra em mente, trust, isso é importante, as pessoas vão confiar mais. Eu te perguntar duas coisas. A primeira é se não existe dentro do que você está pesquisando também um movimento contrário à ideia de que a digitalização pode aumentar a confiança, e evidentemente estou pensando em todo o debate sobre o voto impresso no Brasil, de que os regimes de digitalização, na verdade, eles diminuem a possibilidade de você aferir quem é que está controlando o processo. Se também não tem dentro da própria pesquisa, a gente que está falando, na verdade, a digitalização caminha no sentido oposto, que é uma das bandeiras da extrema-direita, em alguns lugares. Esse é o primeiro ponto. E o segundo ponto, em que medida a inteligência artificial tem um papel na hora de se pensar a confiança que esses processos podem trazer para o Estado. Essa é a primeira pergunta. A segunda pergunta diz respeito à oposição clássica entre política e técnica, de como a burocracia era o elemento que, dentro da formação do Estado, garante que você tenha determinados processos em que eles possam responder por um certo nível de impessoalidade, de neutralidade, e, evidentemente, muito embora a gente saiba que a técnica é política, essa tensão está ali, esse debate. Para que serve? Para que serve a burocracia? Para que a política tenha um certo limite. E aí tem todo esse debate. A minha pergunta é, para onde que vai esse debate? Para onde que vai essa instância de poder, a instância do poder técnico dentro do debate do Estado, que envolvia também uma certa casta de burocratas ou tecnocratas, quando você analisa o processo de digitalização? Para onde é que vai isso? Porque até para fazer, a gente vai fazer qualquer coisa tecnológica, para você fazer um formulário, alguém precisa discutir qual pergunta vai ser feita, quais as categorias que vão entrar, sei lá, para você fazer qual categoria de orientação sexual, quantas caixinhas vão estar lá para as pessoas se identificarem. Para onde é que vai esse debate quando essa coisa se instaura? Porque eu tenho a impressão que ele não desaparece. A gente tem a impressão que ele desaparece, mas ele deve estar em algum lugar. Essa é a pergunta.
See, so that's interesting. I mean, in terms of, one of the interesting things is that all this GovTech word is actually a social movement in its own right. So for something like me that was being basically trained doing a PhD studying social movements and social movement theory, it's really curious as you figure out that it is like a social movement. There is a lot of idealism. There is a lot of a kind of hacker ethic behind it. There are these gatherings where people meet. Also, many people who are part of that, there are programmers, coders, developers who probably make much more money in private sector. So they are in the public sector also animated by basically idealism, because they want to make life better, whatever however that is kind of spelled out. And they basically think, and they have this strong belief that with digital tools, they can make people's life better. No? and they can solve these technical problems that make people's lives so frustrating. But within that cohort, there's not kind of much of a sort of techno critique or anything, you know. There is very much of a kind of techno solutionism. There is an idea that tech will make life better, you know. Though I mean, among some people that there is an awareness of the problems, and so I've been doing some preliminary interviews with some of them. And this paradox of exclusion, no? That by making things more inclusive for some people, you exclude some other people. But yeah, and on the other question, I mean, yeah, it is very fascinating. I mean, Tecnica e Politica, it's a very fascinating contradiction there, but also, in a way, the administrative state. No? It was also partly the result of a social movement in the progressive era in the United States. So there was this idea of a sort of technocratic idealism that you would install a state that was responsive, and it had an idea of public ethos, as it were, no? There was a progressive, so on and so forth. But what we would say, so in this administrative state, curiously, now is really much the target of attack of people like Milei and Trump, who suspect that it has inherently some progressive characteristic to it, you know? Because it has a public ethos. So I would say that even the most kind of technocratic thing, often they have an ideological element attached to them. But yeah, all in all, is really interesting to look at, to actually speak with the community, because you get a sense of the very complex ideology that is there, but mostly, yeah, is a very technocratic ideology. So in ideology, the things that tools we improve things. I mean, what is lacking there politically is an idea of a good society. So there is no discussion really of a good society. Or a good society would be a digitalized society, which is a kind of circular, right, reasoning. Yeah.
Hi. I will ask in Portuguese, but I can clarify anything if you need. Eu achei interessante a ponte que você faz com o populismo. Eu sou o Márcio, eu sou aqui do CCI-Cebrap também, do monitor do debate político no meio digital. Colega do Paolo que tá lá. Então, essa ponte que você faz com o populismo, né? A imagem que você passou é de uma pessoa lidando com a burocracia e de alguma forma desejando se livrar daquilo e vendo no digital uma saída possível. E que aí investigar isso de alguma forma faz a gente entender as raízes do populismo. O que eu fico pensando é que quando eu olho para o populismo, eu vejo uma outra coisa. Eu vejo que o incômodo com a burocracia tem a ver com a formação de uma espécie de uma elite, o que eles imaginam que seja uma elite, e que talvez o digital seja uma saída por eliminar essa elite, e não exatamente por eliminar a burocracia. Eu queria ouvir o que você...
Elite.
Exato. Né? Enfim, não tanto... Eu imagino não tanto a pessoa lidando com a burocracia, e mais ela olhando para os burocratas como privilegiados, e aí, portanto, o digital seria uma forma de eliminar essa elite que eles entendem como parasita ou alguma coisa assim.
Sim, que é muito interessante porque é como uma... It's very interesting because there is a sort of very selective hate towards elite, no? Because basically it's completely fine. Much of these right-wing populism, especially because then populism has very different forms, but it has a very strong suspicion of bureaucracy, state bureaucracy. Then it's in a way completely fine with some corporate bureaucracy, no? So that's true. So, but the interesting thing, so now I'm starting basically to start gathering empirical data and some case studies to really sound some of these hypotheses. And one interesting data regarding populism, so there is a group of leading digital nations, is a group of 7 or 9. So it comprises Israel, South Korea, United Kingdom, Portugal, and yeah, no, it doesn't. Chile, I think, and some other countries in Latin America, Uruguay probably, yeah. And so these are basically the country, Estonia. These are the countries that are kind of considered to be the leading nations in digitalization, the countries who are a model to follow. So they would be the best case to say, okay, let's see if actually these countries that have been so successful in rolling out digital government, whether they manage to fight against populism and fight against public distrust towards the state. Actually, across all these countries in the last years, coinciding with the rollout of digital government, you've seen a further drop in public trust towards the state. Now, it may be incidental, but across all these countries, it has happened. In the UK, right? I mean, it's been a very troubled time, of course, with Brexit. Okay, Israel, no? It's a very peculiar case. But so before the war and everything, we know that there was a lot of anger against Netanyahu and dissension against the state and trouble vis-a-vis the non-responsive state. So it looks, perhaps even if we don't want to use the data to say, hey, digital government actually makes the relationship with the state even worse than before, what it looks, at least, that we can say is that it doesn't solve at all, no, the problem of trust, because it's like trying to solve a problem of legitimacy by means of efficiency, ultimately. No? We're talking about two different things that, of course, are imbricated with one another, no? But legitimacy has to do with a sense that the state is an actor that is worthy of respect, that embodies some project that is that involves citizens, whose procedures are correct and honest. No? It doesn't mean that you do your tax return in 20 seconds. No? So basically, in a way, there it looks as if really with digital government as a solution, it's like expecting, demanding something that the digital government will never be able to deliver, as it says. Yeah?
Hello, Paolo. My name is Luis. I am PhD candidate at the Department of Philosophy of the University of São Paulo. I think this presentation is enough, and I have two questions, two lateral questions concerning your presentation. Mm-hmm. But first, I have a comment about this kind of image that the bureaucratic elite has, and the comment is concerns the reform that Macron passed concerning the École Nationale d'Administration in France, and to respond to this kind of place that created these bureaucratic elites that had this image of dominating the state or something like that. So I think it is a case that has come to my mind when I thought about the attacks that the University of São Paulo has also received coming from the Bolsonaristas, or this kind of radical right that attacks University of São Paulo as this place that created these bureaucrats that are apart from people, etc., etc. But my two lateral questions, one is concerning two moments of your presentation that in one point you describe yourself as a political sociologist, and a little bit later, you cited a political ethnography of bureaucracy in Pakistan. And the question is an epistemological question that I am really curious to hear your comments about it. Do you think that there are any difference between epistemological difference between anthropology, political anthropology, and political sociology? Does this question is still relevant nowadays, or something like that? The second question is not properly a question, but is a comment. You cited Adorno, the negative dialectics, and I thought your design, your research design, is much more Foucaultian, like this kind of, you're describing some kind of episteme, and then describing a type of, I don't know how to say this in English, this kind of cuidado de si, souci de soi, that a citizen becomes a bureaucratic citizen. And the question is if this kind of Foucaultian framework has crossed your mind when you were researching this theme that you presented to us. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I love Foucault, especially as now the radical right hates him. He's become a kind of, so I love him even more. But no, partly, of course, I mean, I didn't think much about that, but partly, of course, this is very much, at least this stage of the research, basically a critique of discourse. So it looks at discourse as Foucault is doing in its work, or similarly to that approach, finding some genealogies of that, finding different key notions, right, and trying to understand and make sense of that and its development. But then usually in my research, then you have the more kind of empirical part that is more kind of sociological. In a sense, it's more empirical. There's interviews, there's surveys. I want to do surveys here. There's something that I've been doing now, started doing, that is actually quite fun. I want to speak with citizens as well. I want to interview citizens. So I think that will be really interesting, like how they are experiencing this, because they never heard. There's no research that really asks citizens how they're perceiving the digital state. And I think that will be really fun, because some of the experience of that is really grotesque. There are some grotesque elements about like Spain offers many of them. I don't know why Spanish bureaucracy is so bad. Coming from Italy, I had very low expectations, but each country has its own cross, right? And but it's very interesting to understand like all these different crosses and why they are there, how they tell us about the very different histories of the state, the very different trajectories of that. But then, I mean, I don't remember calling myself a political anthropologist, but I mean, I'm very, yeah, I kind of mix very different disciplines and affiliations. So in a sense, like my background is in media studies, but then I've gone more and more like into basically sociology of social movements, you know? And much of it was actually ethnography. So it had an anthropological element. Like I'd say still the difference between anthropology and sociology partly is methodological, in a sense that anthropologists tend to study more in-depth communities with a process of immersion, like ethnographic immersion, where they're trying to give a thick description, right? As Clifford Geertz would have it, right? They try really to, through field notes or other materials, to reproduce in great detail what it feels like to be part of the community. But of course, it's say social science shares many methods. I mean, there's much sociology also uses observations, perhaps not in such a rigorous manner, right? But say Durkheim or Weber or other sociologists were using observations. Then you have Bourdieu, even that is more of an ethnographer, really, because he does observations, going to places of Kabyle women, Kabyle villages in Algeria, or working class flats in the periphery of Paris, no? So you see, and Bourdieu is considered a sociologist, right? But much of his method is clearly inspired by anthropology. Right? Yeah.
2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Olivia, and I'm currently working on some research on social movements together with Marcio, which is very, well, works with a lot of things that you have worked with. So that was originally my main draw here, but it was actually very interesting to hear this presentation because I just became a bureaucrat as of 2 weeks ago. I started working in a government agency here at the municipality, which specifically works, it's an innovation laboratory. So it works specifically with this. It's not the part that I personally work with, but these people who are very militant, who work for the state, but are very militant about open government and digitalization are, people who I've met. So more than welcome if you're interested in talking to any of them. And my question is about the effect on the state and on bureaucrats. So which people, when these cuts of losses are being done, and which types of bureaucrats mostly are the ones who are being eliminated. So is it mostly like street levels or other types of people? And well, I'm interested not only because I became one of those myself, but also because I feel like that might have some interesting class effects because, a large part of the middle class are people who work, are bureaucrats, are people who work for the state. So if there's any indication of where that might lead in terms of class effects.
Yes, that's very interesting. So I can answer to that only tentatively, as I don't have a kind of firm empirical data on that. But the general sense I get from literature I've read on these and reports on that is that precisely is this street-level bureaucrat level, the frontline service that is being sacrificed. But it's quite obvious because ultimately what many of these platforms do is precisely this frontline service, right? What they do is the front end, right, the relationship with. And of course, if you roll it out, you can then sacrifice partly some of the physical frontline services you have. I mean, someone before was talking about AI, which I think I forgot to mention. I mean, partly kind of the chatbots, right, are used partly to simulate the street-level bureaucrat experience, right? Someone who can explain you things, right? And indeed, I mean, I think it's not that I'm kind of like a techno Luddite or anything. Is if anything the contrary. So I think that, for example, AI can indeed help in doing many things. But the problem is not AI can be very efficient, but the problem is precisely not efficiency, right? So within the realm of efficiency, we can completely agree they can make things more efficient, but precisely as we talked before, talking about trust, there are other things of the experience of the state that do not enter the field of not part of the field of efficiency, right? Have to do with legitimacy, have to do with involvement, with participation, with feeling part of a community. Yeah? And so that also calls to rethink the role of bureaucrats and the role of bureaucratic spaces, how they can be reframed, how they can be used for spaces of orientation, like community spaces, spaces where people can meet other people, can share ideas, can have support, can be guided through. So I think that the big challenge consists in that. I mean, okay, fine with digitalization, but how do we rethink the role of spaces and the role of bureaucratic places, the role of government sites? Do we close them all down, really? Or perhaps don't we want to rethink their offices, giving them different purposes? But yeah, I'd love to speak with bureaucrats. Yeah.
Bom, boa noite. Meu nome é Fernando. Eu queria fazer duas perguntas. Uma é sobre os cidadãos excluídos. Na sua pesquisa, você vê eles reclamarem dessa exclusão e como eles reclamam? E a outra é sobre o Estado. Nesses casos, como o Estado está fazendo para incluir essas pessoas ou os Estados não estão fazendo nada?
So how the citizen is feels. I mean, so that is the question that I cannot answer much now, as I fundamentally lack this data, right? From speaking with citizens and interviewing them. I mean, it would really be interesting, like interviewing people to get all the possible typology of digital frustration, and I think it would be not a 2x2 table, but more a kind of 12x12. There are all these many possible ways in which things can go wrong, which is just amazing, no? So I don't know how citizens basically perceive that or live through that. I mean, I know anecdotally from my own experience and from the experience of others that there is this sense. I mean, I will give you this anecdote that basically in Spain there is a system of appointment online, cita previa, that people use to get appointment to municipality, whatever. And that basically functions, and I think it's similar to other countries, what happens elsewhere. Basically, it gives you a time, say 8 o'clock in the morning, you need to go there, and in a space of few seconds, you need to click. You have to be the quickest click in the West, in the far West, and often you arrive there and it's all the places are already gone, right? And then people do it again the other day. Then on Thursday, for whatever reason, they open also in the afternoon. You can have a fastest click competition. People who don't want to go do that, they can go to an internet cafe and purchase for €5 an appointment, which is of course illegal. They're offering this service where you pay €5 and they give you an appointment. So it has also created a market for appointment services. So that just tells you like something about like some of these frustrations, that they're seeping up. And does the state want to include people? I mean, partly it wants to include people, but this also offers a perfect way to more efficiently exclude other people, right? And not hear of them anymore. So in one of basically what I've done in the first year is been not proper interviews, because I did want to have more kind of freewheeling conversations. So I did kind of scoping discussions, what I called, to get a sense of where I was going. And in one of these bureaucrat in Britain was telling me about the story of this local town council and the case of this guy who had many problems, and people who have problems tend to have. Misery loves company, no? So this person had addiction problems, had family problems, had children problems, had drug problems, had debt problems, had home problems, had no. So these problems tend to be assigned to 12 different departments, no. But he was going to this town council place that was precisely for citizen advice, but he couldn't enter the place because he didn't have an email. And in order to register, in order to enter, he had to be registered. In order to be registered, he had to have an email. In order to have an email, he had to be not the person he was, because he couldn't, he was fighting for his life, basically. He didn't, right? So there's a lot of assumptions that are made about that. For example, like having an email has become, a sort of requirement for participation in society. No? And there was a guy I met who was part of the Lulzsec hacking group. That was part of Anonymous. So he was a 16-year-old when he was part of that. And he was condemned to go to spend some time in this minor jail and stuff. And then when he was freed, he was condemned not to use the internet, which basically was probably the worst punishment for a hacker, which meant basically that he couldn't use an email, which meant that he couldn't get a job, right? Because to apply for a job, you need to have a curriculum, and you need to send a curriculum and you need to answer to emails, right? So it was cut out of social and economic life completely by this injunction of not, no? And what is scary about these forms of exclusion is that they are more perverse and covert than they were previously, right? So that they are more efficient, right? But in many respects more pernicious.
Bom, acho que foram muitas perguntas. Muito obrigada, Paolo, por ter estado conosco e dividir a sua pesquisa mais recente. Foi muito bacana ter você aqui e nós agradecemos muito. E como a Camila disse no começo, os livros do Paolo estão sendo vendidos lá fora, inclusive o Estado de Caos é uma pré-venda, ainda não chegou nas livrarias, então quem quiser pode ir lá comprar o livro. Aí é com ele, se ele topar, autografar. Obrigada.